One of the great cosmological concerns of the medieval world is expressed in a tale called The Voyage of the Ikara, one of these voyage tales. It's one of the 12th century in medieval Ireland. It's a tale of the sea voyage of three brothers off the coast of the west of Ireland, who, when looking at the setting sun in the Atlantic, asked the fundamental question: where does the sun go when he goes under the sea? And this is a question that also figures in the 9th century text in Teanga Bit Nua, the ever-new tongue. This has been studied by John Carey, who I've mentioned already. This is an apocryphal text in which the spirit of the Apostle Philip, whose tongue was cut out 9 times and 9 times miraculously regenerated. It's surprising what you learn when you have to pursue these mythical elements. Philip addresses the wise men of Jerusalem to explain the creation of the world to them. And here we are told that on the 4th day of creation, God made the fiery circuit of the sun, which illuminates 12 planes beneath the edges of the world in its shining every night. And portions of the message of St. Philip, the ever-new tongue, run as follows. It is thus the sun goes every evening. First it shines on the stream beyond the sea, bringing it news of the waters in the east. Then it shines at night upon the lofty sea of fire, and so on and so on. In fact, the sequence is a very long one. But you'll note the phrase, at one point the sun shines upon the flocks of birds who sing many songs together in the valley of the flowers. Carey points out that this allusion, like some others in the tale, are probably comparable to the marvels of the otherworld in Irish tradition, while others obviously arise from Gnostic writing in late antique Egypt. But once again in this tale, we have a preoccupation with where does the sun go at night. And this belief in the nocturnal voyage of the sun had a long ancestry in prehistoric Europe. The Nordic Bronze Age has an exceptional iconographic repertoire on stone and bronze. And very briefly, when you run through it, you'll see that this belief in the nocturnal voyage of the sun is echoed there thousands of years before Philip and the 3 lads in the voyage of the Ikara expressed similar concerns in medieval Ireland. Various commentators in Scandinavia, as you know, have expressed have suggested that there's a complex solar cosmology reflected in this various imagery. The best known example, of course, is the famous Trundholm sun disk. This was found in 1902 in a peat bog, and I think it was in 1962, an archaeologist named Hans Drescher was the first to point out that the gold-plated side of this famous disk is mounted in such a fashion that it's drawn, as you can see, from left to right, from east to west. And when you reverse the image of the sun chariot, the back of the disk, which was never gilded and remained simply bronze, represents, it would seem, the sun's journey in the reverse direction, under the land or under the sea, to its rebirth in the east. This sort of sun cycle has now been identified by Fleming Call on a series of bronze razors, also in the Nordic Bronze Age. And here you can just see 2 examples. It's a similar cyclical story. On one of these, number 1 there, a solar boat is seen traveling from left to right. It contains 2 figures that may well be twin solar deities. Then, on another example, number 2 there, you have a boat without a solar symbol traveling in the opposite direction, followed by a fish. And according to Call, this is a ship of the night and the underworld. And such left-sailing vessels, when they can be identified in Denmark, never contain solar symbols. You can see that the solar boat here is a boat with horses' heads. It's a reflection, like on the Trundholm disk, of the sacral nature of the horse in this part of the Bronze Age, in this part of the world. But horse heads were replaced by birds' heads in the 12th or 13th century, and this continued into the Iron Age. And very briefly, the decoration, for example, on the Vienna situla, a bronze bucket in private collections in Central Europe, studied by Stefan Wirth. It essentially consists, as you can see, it's number 2 there, of rows of sun ships sailing around the circumference of the vessel, one above the other. And Stefan Wirth thinks in its mirror imagery, this evokes the sun's journey above and below the horizon. And as he points out, this is a cosmological narrative that recalls the celestial and the otherworldly voyages of the sun. And it's possible that other sorts of representations of the sun on these vessels contain abbreviated versions of this complex cosmological belief. For example, in certain cases, as on number 1 there, a Hungarian vessel, the central image is, as you can see, a very clear solar boat. The solar disk has birds' heads on either side. But then there are inturned birds' heads with smaller bosses. And this is possibly an abbreviated version of this cosmic story. I would suggest that these opposed or reversed birds are intended to denote the nocturnal otherworld voyage of the sun. Inverted boats may actually tell a similar story. And there are examples of these to be found both in Scandinavian rock art and indeed on bronze vessels, boats placed, keel to keel, one above the other. A journey to the other world is also possibly represented in the small bronze discs that decorated the famous wagon in the burial at Vix, which I'll have more to say about in a later lecture, because here in the bottom illustration you can see 2 of these bronze discs. There's clearly a solar disk with birds' heads above and below the solar symbol. The last voyage of the high status woman who was buried here is probably reflected in this solar symbolism. It's also found, by the way, on Torques in the Marne region in northern France in the Latin period. And moving to these islands, the same sort of solar symbolism and the same allusion to celestial and otherworldly voyages of the sun occurs on a series of discs in Ireland. It's most easily seen on the famous Petrie crown, now in the National Museum in Dublin and named after the antiquarian George Petrie, who unfortunately didn't record its provenance. But as you can see, the right-hand disc below the one surviving of a pair of horns, on this sheet bronze object, you have a very clear representation of a solar boat with stylized birds' heads, and then in the center of the boat there is a solar disk. The disc on the left is more puzzling. It appears to have an inverted boat, but again the birds' heads, albeit rather stylized, are still clearly visible. Various people, when they studied this object in the past, saw sort of traces of a human face here, and the solar symbolism remained effectively unrecognized, though it was pointed out many years ago by Sprokov in a paper in the 1950s. The same is true of a series of bronze discs about which we have very little information, other than at least 2 of them were found in pairs. One is a pair from Monasterevin, and one is another pair possibly from County Armagh. But once again, these aren't, as some people have suggested, great staring faces or even grotesque fish designs. These are in effect highly stylized solar symbols once again. And the pairing is extremely interesting because, as you can see, on the left you have the outward turned birds' heads at either end, the prow and stern of the solar boat containing the solar symbol. But then the other element of the pair has the inturned birds' heads, suggesting, I think, the nocturnal voyage of the sun. I think the pairing is highly significant. We have here a complex cosmological tale reflected in much the same way as it was shown on the Trundholm sun disk over 1,000 years before. objects such as these are normally dated to the 1st century BC, 1st century AD. They could well be a little later. But in fact, this symbolism also finds expression in some very fine Iron Age metalwork in Britain. The most obvious example, I suppose, is the famous Battersea shield, which has in the upper and lower roundels inversion and normal representation, as you can see. The lower roundel there has a highly stylized solar boat with a solar disk in the center, and the upper roundel in this complex piece is an inverted version of the same. This solar imagery, I think, continues into the famous artwork of the Iron Age mirrors, studied so comprehensively by Jody Joy. And I think, again, what we're witnessing here is a deliberate attempt to conceal the solar imagery and perhaps to mystify it in some way. But I have no doubt that it was very familiar to those who gazed on these objects. And here again we have an expression, I think, of a cosmographical belief that was widespread in ancient Europe. It is true to say, of course, that it only surfaces in different places at different times. Denmark, Central Europe, Ireland and Britain, Bronze Age, Iron Age. But we shouldn't expect a belief like this to be reflected in every aspect of the archaeological record in every geographical region. What's interesting here, I think, is the sheer longevity of the concept. We have a theme, the celestial, diurnal and nocturnal voyage of the sun, reflected in different ways over a period of 2,000 years. It's a complex pre-literate cosmology that takes us from Trundholm to the ever-new tongue in 9th century Ireland, and indeed, I suppose, to the voyage of the Chariot even later. And the late Iron Age Petrie crown and the Battersea shield are just two objects that show the persistence of this model right to the early centuries AD. I wonder if the author of the ever-new tongue, albeit in a literate Christian context, realized he was reiterating a theory of the otherworld journey of the sun that in one form or another was a widespread one and certainly as old as the Bronze Age. In fact, I think it may well have been current in Newgrange when the mystery of the sun's reappearance from the otherworld was celebrated there at the winter solstice. Now, I know we have ranged rather widely, but we've been trying to answer O'Kelly's question. Could aspects of a Neolithic people's beliefs and practices survive for thousands of years to be embedded in medieval texts? Taking the disparate strands of evidence together, protracted veneration and usage of tombs like altar, the mnemonic capacity of enduring monuments like the inviolate Newgrange, still a place to remember of potent magic in the 12th century, the longevity of cosmological concepts like this solar story that I've spelled out, the historical robustness of the oral traditions of the Tlingit people in faraway Alaska. I think the answer has to be now a qualified yes to O'Kelly's question, which means we can now look, I hope, a little more confidently at the references in other tales to the other world, to sacral kings, to goddesses of sovereignty, and they will be the targets of the next few lectures. Thank you very much.